welcome everybody again to this session organized by the Maastricht Law and Tech Lab on cybersecurity risks, which is a very hot item, at least in the Netherlands, for public institutions or sort of public institutions. There's a lot of news in the Netherlands on institutions that have been struck by cyber attacks. So Maastricht University was a victim of a cyber attack and ransomware attack December 2019. And very recently in this month, also other universities, the University of Amsterdam and the University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam, were also struck. And even more recently, the NWO, which is the Dutch science organization, which hands out grants to academics, also was struck by a ransomware attack. So this is a very topical debate, and we're very happy that we have two experts, Ian Brown and Michael Veal. Ian comes from, I hope I pronounced it correctly, the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Michael is associated with University College London, UK. And then we have two renowned experts in this field who are going to talk about cybersecurity risks for public institutions. And what I really like about this is that cybersecurity has been approached from a technical point of view, and rightfully so, for many decades. But there seems to be an increased attention for also more the social aspects of things. So the ethical aspects, but also the legal dimension of cybersecurity. So I'm very happy that we have these two speakers who will have a presentation of around 20 minutes. We can go a little bit over, but at least we'll have approximately 30 minutes for a discussion. So that means that if you have any questions, then you can write them down, keep them in your memory, or maybe post them in the chat, and we can have a discussion after the presentation about questions that might pop up during the presentation. So Ian and Michael, the floor is yours, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Gies and Catalina, for inviting us. This presentation is based on a concept note that Michael and I did for Internet Policy Review on the concept of cybersecurity, and actually a bit what Gies was just saying about the broadening of the focus and the multidisciplinary nature of it is something we'll go into a bit more, as well as public policy responses, which will link to the public institutions. I'm not, this isn't cybersecurity for universities, a how-to guide. You have experts to do that for you, obviously, already. It's a sort of broader look at the topic, which has relevance for government and how government and public institutions think through these issues. So I'll show you briefly how the more technical focus going back to the 1970s around what I call information security, I'll say more about that in a moment, to this very popular C word now that is widely used, but also talk a little bit about yet another concept of security engineering that I think is very promising. Michael is going to talk a bit about how the legal framework has evolved around cybersecurity, and also the importance of human factors issues. That's something that the computer scientists of the 70s and 80s were not so focused on, with unsurprisingly poor results. And then this is my new favorite cyber word, cybersecuritization, which Michael came up with, and institutionalization Michael will talk about, and then we'll perhaps both chip in right at the end with the conclusion. So this, this image that's up on this slide is a quite standard computer science with a bit of maybe management science involved. In the middle is what computer scientists often think of as the core of cybersecurity, what they call the Cia Triad. It's not as exciting as it sounds, nothing to do with the Americans, but that refers to protecting the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information and information systems. Obviously, those have hardware and software elements, and of course, particularly since the internet became so mainstream, most computers these days are connected. There are elements you can see in the rings around the outside relating to the physical security. As people say, the cloud is just someone else's computer. Ultimately, computer systems are physical entities, and that's important for security. It's really very difficult to protect a computer or a computing device against adversaries where they have physical access to it, where you don't control the physical access. There are important elements of personnel security, which link to what Michael will talk about with human factors. And I'm sorry, but the little zoom window is hiding. Oh yes, procedural, organizational security. I couldn't quite see the edge of the slide there. Okay. We looked just to see how the use of these various evolving terms in mainstream literature. So this is an analysis from Google's Ngram viewer of broad literature. We also in the paper have a more focused scholarly literature analysis, and as you can see from the 60s onwards, people tended, computer scientists mainly, I mean mathematicians, physicists, electronic engineers, then it wasn't even such a well-recognized discipline in the 1960s, tended to focus on the security of computers themselves, partly because they weren't generally connected. There were small numbers of them. They were mainframes. You can see that persisted into the 80s. Data security became a bit more popular in the 80s, so a bit more focus on the data that was being processed by computing systems. Then you can see that information security really took off in the 90s. It may well be I tend to prefer information security just because of my age. That's when I did my PhD. So I might just be really old here saying I don't like cybersecurity, but there are other reasons for cybersecurity, I think, being not quite such a good word. I'll show you in a moment. But you can see that really started to take off in the late 90s and then has really taken off in the 2000s. And I'll come back to security engineering in a little while. I think this is a good current day definition from the UN body that's responsible for telecommunication, the International Telecommunication Union, ITU. I'm not going to read it all out, but the key thing there I wanted to get over: cybersecurity is not a narrow technical issue. It's not just encryption, firewalls, virus checking, and so on. Although those are obviously important technical elements of cybersecurity, it's much broader than that these days. Relating not just to the tools you use, but organizational policies, guidelines, risk management approaches. You can see a focus on organization and users' assets in lots of different senses. And then the last sentence you could say is the core of it, although it's a high level definition. Cybersecurity strives to ensure the attainment and maintenance of the security properties of the organization and users' assets against relevant security risks in the cyber environment. Although note that's still, capitalist is the wrong word, but it's all about assets and protecting assets. And that's some of the interesting stuff. Michael will come to perhaps more of a shift to protecting people in more modern day discussions of cybersecurity. One of my favorite hashtags, cyber. Where does the cyber word come from? Interestingly, I did not know this actually before Michael and I did this research, but apparently cyber and cyberspace and cybersecurity have evolved from different historical usages. So going all the way back to the mid to late 19th century, Maxwell, who discovered the electron, also wrote in the Proceedings of the Royal Society about the notion of a governor. This is in the technical sense. It keeps he was talking about early motor vehicles and keeping the speed of a motor vehicle relatively constant, even with fluctuations in input power and other variables. I'm sure you've heard of Wiener's cybernetics and the notion of homeostasis. That's similar to Maxwell's governor, that you keep it's a way for a system to keep itself relatively stable, even with lots of changes around it. So Wiener, I think, historically was looking at artillery in the Second World War and how to reliably hit targets, even with wind and other conditions affecting the artillery. And then by the mid-1990s, those of you that were in academia or even in school, I think it was in popular culture by the mid-1990s, never mind in academia, cyber was everywhere as a prefix, adjective, and even noun. I think that is the worst. I hate cyber as a noun. I'm sure you know the root of cyberspace, William Gibson, his science fiction writing in the early 90s, he's got some very evocative language about it, but the crux of what Gibson meant referring to cyberspace was widespread interconnected digital technology. But actually, he got bored of the idea. By 2000, he said it was evocative, but essentially meaningless. Another colleague of mine, Mark Graham at the Oxford Internet Institute, has written nicely about how geographers think the notion of cyberspace as a physical separate space is a nonsense. These are tools that are integrated into our everyday lives, and that's why cybersecurity is important, because they have an effect on our everyday lives. They're not a separate domain. In particular, the use of cyber tends to be, and cybersecurity alongside it, very popular in the defense and intelligence worlds. So Andrea Matwishin, who's a US academic lawyer who's done a lot of work on cybersecurity, has traced that and said, you can see actually it's what Lessig called even in the early 90s, East Coast code versus West Coast code, law and lawmakers versus the culture of Silicon Valley. Cybersecurity tends to be what you hear policymakers and legislators, as well as national security, defense, intelligence people, whereas techies tend to call it information security, infosec, or even just security, and we'll come back right to the end. Whereas Ben Wagner and Killian Veith, I think, noted in 2016, cyber as a word was becoming a metaphor for threat scenarios and militarization. Michael will come back to that. Okay, Michael, if you just point at me when you want me to go forward.
I'll do the next slide, please.
Yes.
So after Ian's great introduction, we had to think about what role the law had and has in cybersecurity, and this is a pretty interesting zone. The first thing to realize is there isn't really a cybersecurity law per se. I mean, there are that exist, the Cybersecurity Act in the EU, for example, but when you look at these acts, they're not really very much of substance. And when we actually go to laws to find out who is prosecuted on issues of cybersecurity, which laws oblige organizations to act to secure their systems, and also which laws oblige public institutions, both of the sort of run-of-the-mill kind like universities, but also of intelligence agencies and so on to act to secure their systems. These are all very different instruments. So cybersecurity is a jigsaw across laws, and often when we find a provision that relates to cybersecurity, it might not use either of those words at all. It's important to look at some laws, however, in this space. One of them is data protection law. Traditionally, this wasn't seen as a particularly important cybersecurity law historically because personal databases and data banks were quite limited and contained. But now we've seen the internet and the use of the internet in connecting data, the widespread use of tracking on the internet, and the general datafication of organizations means that there's very little that can't be arguably considered to either be personal data or be adjacent to or near some personal data. So when you get cybersecurity provisions, such as the security principle in the GDPR, you do end up having to secure your whole system because any entry point to that system might end up to somebody accessing personal data. You also have, this is linking to Ian's point on information security and the connection between the two. The history of cybersecurity has been quite a lot on information management. When we look at the use of it in the military setting, it's been on access control, so top secret information, and going down to information that more lowly officials were allowed access to. And similarly, that poses challenges, socio-technical challenges, as well as pure technical ones. And we see that in areas like data protection law as well. We see actually good information management is really required for a lot of other things, not necessarily hiding top secret information, but accessing, when someone says, can I have access to my data? You need to know where that data is. You need to know if it's been backed up in places. If somebody wants it deleted, you have to be able to erase it thoroughly, but also not compromise the integrity of your system while you do so. So many of the aspects of cybersecurity come in very strongly here. We also see another theme that's not just in data protection law, but many other legal instruments too, around breaches, data breaches and breach notifications. This isn't just a breach in the sense of, you would hack a water pipe and water comes flowing out. We also are considering the damage to the infrastructure as itself being a breach. So you could have breaches of as Ian talked about, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and consider all of these things to be breaches. And a kind of meme in the law is that when a significant breach happens, you have to notify somebody. We see that in data protection law. We see that in the EIDAS directive, maybe sooner regulation, Network and Information Systems directive. And we also see it in various American laws, state laws, national laws that relate to different sectors or types of systems or so on. So those are some overarching places we find cybersecurity obligations. And there are many more sector-specific laws as well, which provide different piecemeal obligations. But we also find some technology-specific laws too. So we find, and these are maybe not too advisable, in California they have an Internet of Things law, which is really wholly aimed at removing default passwords from devices. When you buy some smart light bulb and it comes with the password 1234, and it's the same for everybody, well, that could be a vector into your entire home network, potentially, depending on the setup. So things like changing those or requiring those to be randomly generated, we find in some laws, but we know that technology-specific law isn't always a great idea, because it's not only does it struggle to keep up, but it ends up trying to be repurposed, and when technologies change, and that can create tensions too. So we can see this repurposing, interestingly, when we also look at generic laws. So historically, how has the law dealt with basically breaches of cybersecurity, things that we would now think of as cybercrime? Well, in the early days, let's look at a UK case here, RV Gold and Shafin. This is in the House of Lords. There were failures to prosecute things that would be considered illegal today. In that case, you had two engineers at Gold and Shafin, and I'm not sure the exact factual situation, but effectively they gained access. I'm not sure anyone knows for sure. I think they're sort of a bit cagey about it now. They gained access to a username and password of a view data database system that runs on telephone lines from the post office. In effect, they could log in to the system and access data of emails of people and of public institutions' internet systems. It was using a certain other type of database, but not the internet as we know it today. But broadly, BT and also the intelligence agencies in the UK were pretty annoyed at this, and they wanted to prosecute. Even though it's arguable whether that was a particularly good idea. They weren't really trying to benefit from this. They actually informed their superiors of this breach. But they repurposed the law of forgery. And they said, what you've done is you've taken a username and password, and you're pretending you're the real owner of this username and password, and you're trying to tell the computer so it accepts it as the real thing. It's a counterfeit, though. It doesn't work. The House of Lords quite confidently rejected this and said, look, it's probably right that this should be a crime, but it's not a crime at the moment. You can't go and repurpose a law of forgery, because all you're doing is tricking a computer database. It's not the same as someone appraising, a faked Ming vase. And if we let you expand the generic law in that way, it's going to create tensions later on that are going to be pretty undesirable for certainty of law and lots of other areas, and justice in general. But things like the FTC Act in the US, we have seen the expansion of such generic rules. We see that the unfair and deceptive practices doctrine in the FTC Act has been used to criticize or to fine or to take other actions against firms with poor security practices. So we have seen some generic laws have migrated outwards, but also taking to the US, but also some other jurisdictions too. Instead of the law of forgery, the most common metaphor we see really from older versions of law in cybersecurity is often the law of trespass. So you're trespassing onto a computer system or doing damage to it or so on. And this has not been without its problems itself. So it's much more successful than repurposing the law of forgery. But it's very hard to repurpose the law of trespass very simply, because it's hard to know when you're authorized or not. We have many social norms in reality for saying, are you allowed on in my backyard? Did I say you could be here? Do you have some other good reason to be here? And I'm no expert on that in the US case situation, where we think of it as sort of trespass being a very serious thing compared to in many European countries. But authorization in physical space has these social routines and expectations. But in virtual environments, we see that it's hard because what if you just browsed a very, very long URL? you'd come across it, and actually that URL contained a username and password as part of the input to the URL. You get the question marks at the end, and then it can enter, it can pass through variables to the website it's visiting. If those contained a username and password that you'd found online, and you click that link, were you authorized? Well, that was a link that someone may have put online accidentally or not, but the intent was you weren't meant to be there. That was intended to be a secured system, but in fact it wasn't. So we find those interesting barriers there, and we see that as a constant tension when someone is unauthorized or not, because we don't have the routines. So yeah, Ian, please, next slide. Thanks. So a bit of a whiz over some of the legal parts. Where did that go from there? Well, what we see in the law as well is that security breaches affect humans. That's when the law tends to get involved. And interestingly, more recent security definitions of cybersecurity in the law, such as in the Cybersecurity Act, actually acknowledge this, and acknowledge that humans are sometimes the source of cybersecurity breaches, and really ultimately we are in general, because we made these systems at some point, but they also affect humans, and they can affect humans as assets in an organization, and we can see them being used for blackmail and doxing and disinformation, and we can consider these things as an extension somehow of cybersecurity. Whether it's a good or bad idea to put them in that frame, it's still up for debate. But as Adams and Sasser pointed out in 1999, these are the two people very heavily involved in the creation or pushing of human factors and more human considerations in cybersecurity. Hackers at that point were often paying more attention to the human link than designers were. And that's because if we think of security as just the IT department of an organization, or maybe just the computer, as Ian pointed out in those definitions earlier on, we miss a lot. Today, people bring their own devices to other networks. You can't secure them unless you have a very, very tight organization, like you work for, you work for the NSA, and you're not going to be able to bring your own device into the building, let alone and use the network and into work. But at the same time, when you're in a normal organization, you're bringing your own devices around, you may be using them to communicate with your colleagues in a more informal way that's more fluid and easy. They're also connecting to the environment and so on. And users configure their networked world with the tools around them, whether they're work or personal tools. We see that in the European Court of Human Rights, workplace surveillance. You can have privacy in work email, because it reflects the idea that we actually use the tools around us to configure our lives, and we don't siphon off and firewall what we do in the way that maybe security professionals might like those unruly humans to do. And sometimes people also run communities, Facebook fan pages, forums, and so on, which can themselves generate new forms of risk or be vectors for attack, undermining various human assets, as well as being used as ways into to backends of technical systems. Another gap that we see that cybersecurity is coming to terms with slowly is that a threat model is not necessarily a teenager in their bedroom with a hoodie. It can be someone that you live with and even are in an intimate relationship with. And when we see how many people's accounts are compromised, so social media accounts, for example, it's often by someone who has access to your device and knows the password to unlock it, like an intimate partner. And so in these cases, the threat model is really important. And threat models are a constant feature of cybersecurity literature, and the broadening of those is a theme that we're seeing as well. Lastly, on this, we have the role of human-computer interaction. Human-computer interaction is the general field of study. It sort of spans psychology, computer science, sociology as well. A wide variety of methods are deployed. And it really emphasizes in this field of usable security, which is a sort of term that has emerged here, that you have to consider the human factors, not just of users at the end who might be pesky and ruining your well-built system, but also designers who will be implementing quite complex cryptographic schemes incorrectly, or sysadmins who might not be monitoring something particularly well, or might introduce new vulnerabilities through their practices. So usable security is this field of better fitting a security task with all the humans interacting with that task. And that's a field that is constantly daunting, but one that we're still working on a lot today. So, I think they're all gone. Where's it gone? Can we pull up some of these points, Ian? There we go. Great. So the last point I want to talk about before I pass back to Ian is this term that Ian claims I invented. I've never actually searched to see if it really didn't exist. It doesn't exist hugely in academic literature, but I think it's a more recent observation. Many of the people in this call will be working on a lot of areas of the intersection of computers and society. Maybe not cybersecurity, but many other areas too. And that's where it becomes important to think about cyber securitization and this dynamic change that's taken place. So to one extent, we could think of cyber securitization as effectively the fact that national security issues have become more cyber. That national security is now a threat from issues that we would consider to be issues that exist in this C word world. And that's important, and we see that there's big offensive and defensive capabilities from state actors, and equally those resonate downstream. So I don't know what happened to Maastricht University in the exact details, but many organizations are finding that they're becoming subject of vulnerabilities that the intelligence agencies knew existed, but maybe did not inform manufacturers because of the potential use for those bugs to be used by intelligence agencies. So we see that as a trend. So in fact, we do see that the national securitization of computing is something that concerns us all. However, there's a flip side to this word, and this word could also be used to describe the idea that computer issues have become many social computer and society issues have become cybersecurity flavored issues. So cybersecurity is really the first area it's really the first time computers were taken seriously by businesses all over the place, big boardrooms who saw things as risks. They weren't just saying, okay, there's a system, there's an HR database, that's fine, we can leave that below. No, cybersecurity is one of the first computing issues that hits the board level of organizations, public and private sector. But because of this, we have whole institutional structures that Ian will touch upon a bit more that result from cybersecurity. These institutional structures are often those tasked now with considering issues like privacy or fairness or even disinformation, and they inherit some of the tools, frames, and lenses from cybersecurity. Now, why might this be? Well, institutions and whole technical fields of training, people resemble each other, people look to copy other models that have worked successfully in other parts of their organization or other organizations. That's called institutional isomorphism. We also have training pipelines that might be repurposed. So you might say, okay, I know you're trained to do cybersecurity, but we really need you to do privacy now. So can you apply your skills there? Organizational structures and routines and accepted forms of knowledge about computers maybe look quite technical in terms of information leakage, in terms of, we've got cybersecurity assurance programs and certifications. What is known to be accepted can be copied from those fields. And lastly, there's also just been a long attraction to the dollar in cybersecurity. And so any organization that thinks it can work in cybersecurity, but there might be extra money in privacy, fairness, or disinformation, for example, might be moving there. So that's those three, whiz through those topics from me, and I'll turn to Ian to talk about institutions.
Okay, just I know we're slightly running over, but just second final slide. This is where we focus a little more on the public institution side. Obviously, what we've said so far is quite broad. Michael and I, as well as the concept note we've been talking about, we worked with two colleagues, Chris Marsden and James Lee, in 2019. I'm losing track of time now, with COVID year in between, on election cybersecurity across the Commonwealth, 54 member states of the Commonwealth. Looking in particular at how election commissions or election management boards, they're often called in other Commonwealth countries, are taking steps to secure the technologies that they are increasingly used in their elections. None of them are using e-voting, thank goodness, remote e-voting, because of the security issues that leads to. But of course, almost all of them are using computers to manage voter databases, for example, to schedule the logistics around running polling day, perhaps even to do some of the counting of ballot papers, to share the results back with the headquarters. And election commissions, by and large, they're interesting. I mean, even much more than non-technical universities, they're not full of computer scientists and technical specialists and people who just take cybersecurity issues for granted. And so thinking thinking about, and we spent quite a bit of time going, and we surveyed all of the 54 EMBs, but we also went and did field work in Pakistan and in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the UK, thinking about how can these electoral bodies get the cybersecurity expertise they need as a public institution, as part of government, to secure their elections. So these were some of the things that we observed and recommended in the guide that we wrote for the Commonwealth. A strong link to government-led national cybersecurity strategies. Governments these days, certainly in the EU, this is a requirement of the NIS directive, have what are called either computer emergency response teams. Many organizations have these as well, CERTs, or computer security incident response teams, CSIRTs. So that those organizations played a big role with electoral bodies that we observed. We also strongly, this is something that you often see in technical cybersecurity standards like the ISO 27000 series, the importance of having board level decision making about cybersecurity issues. That's, most organizations these days are significantly dependent on computers. Obviously, universities very much so, funding agencies very much so, and so you need very senior people that really understand these issues and will make sure that their organizations are taking the steps that they should be. One specific issue that often comes alongside that in public institutions, where those institutions are running digital infrastructure themselves, where do they get the security experts they need? Because cybersecurity is a very hot career field. People can earn a lot of money in the private sector, really very large salaries in the private sector. Can universities, can government agencies compete with that? This was something we actually, in some senses, was one of the most important conversations we had with electoral bodies, finding ways, especially in the small island developing states in the Caribbean and the Pacific that make up a significant fraction of the Commonwealth's membership, about ways they had found to train their own staff, perhaps to take on very junior staff to give them some experience where they could still afford the salary before that person, trebled the salary by going into the private sector. So I suspect, and this is the one sort of university specific thing I'll say, I suspect universities will face some of these issues as well. Can they pay the salaries they need for the cybersecurity experts? Because universities, by and large, do run a lot of their own digital infrastructure. This obviously links to bigger questions about public outsourcing of functions. You could just say, well, universities, electoral commissions and so on just can't run this stuff themselves. They're going to outsource it to Amazon or whoever. Even if they do that, though, they still need the managerial capability to understand what they're outsourcing is leading to, what the companies they are paying for are actually doing and taking appropriate steps. So, Michael, shall we just have final thoughts in our conclusions? Blah blah blah. That actually, the second last bullet point was what I was just saying. This is from a paper we cite that was mainly looking at developing countries, but actually this is true of the rich world as well. That many organizations lack, as well as the technological capabilities, organizational human resources, and other fundamental ingredients needed to secure their system. And I suspect that is what is behind a lot of security breaches that we still see today. Many organizations just have not yet got to the point they need to of taking these issues seriously enough. I'm not saying that specifically about the organizations that you mentioned at the start, because I don't know the details of what happened there. But I think this is a big problem in the public sector to some extent because of lack of resources, but of course in the private sector as well. Michael, do you want to finish on security engineering, or do you want me to?
I know, feel free, go for it.
So actually, this is why I personally like Ross Anderson, who's Cambridge University Professor of Security Engineering. That's his title, and a very comprehensive book that he's now up to the 3rd edition of. I think if you're interested in these topics broadly, it's a really good, not just introduction to the field, introduction and really comprehensive look across all of the areas that Michael and I have talked about today. I've worked with Ross for a long time, and I think he's been really pioneering in thinking about these security issues very broadly. And who will be the security engineers and managers in public institutions in future, I think is a really important question for governments in terms of where they're getting their own staff, but funding education, funding perhaps graduate level programs in national universities where governments are doing that. The UK government certainly does that to a significant degree now, as well as PhD programs, because that's the kind of expertise very specific government agencies need on these issues. There's lots more in our open access paper there, but I'm very happy to take questions and discuss this with you all now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ian and Michael. This was great. So we do have room for questions, and let me. So let's use the use hand function, and if you click on participants, you will have an option where you can raise your hand. And I saw that Bogdan Kovrik, one of our colleagues at the Law and Tech Lab, has raised his hand. So Bogdan, go ahead.
Hi, hello. Thanks a lot for the presentation and the paper itself. It was really, really great to hear you and see you today. So I kept on thinking on the second last Ian's point there. And I know you kind of answered the questions, but I wanted to propose maybe we can discuss it a little bit more, because I think it's a very, very interesting conversation. So I wanted mainly to ask, why do you think, more of a matter of opinion, maybe, why do you think that's not such a big thing of publicly outsourcing cybersecurity or any kind of digital or cyber processes to well experts as public institutions? And then you kind of answered that, but then I was thinking, how do you think countries that are still kind of lagging behind, some of the countries are still struggling to kind of transfer everything they have into a digital world, kind of process citizens' informations and all we have to do online and things like that. So I was thinking, let's go to base zero now, and maybe we can think how public institutions and countries should handle this digitalization of information to make it first from the very first step, a very secure and kind of easy process. Thank you.
Interesting point. I would say part of the problem is that security generally is still not the really critical element of software and system design and production that it should be. And so even if you actually have the money to go out and buy a system or to set something up, you really have to be very careful in how you do it and how you configure it. Obviously, you need to be constantly keeping it up to date, patching it, finding out about new vulnerabilities, new flaws that you have to protect against. It's an ongoing job. Obviously, it's not just a fire and forget. And what is the underlying source of that? I think a significant element of it is actually just the really straightforward issue of liability for faults. By and large, people that produce software especially have been very successful for decades in disclaiming all liability, and through click-through contracts, that kind of stuff, which Michael may want to say more about on the legal side. And so, it's pretty basic economics that if you can throw off costs onto other people, you externalize costs. Well, that's a wonderful thing for you. It's not a wonderful thing for them, and you're not going to put the resources into protecting your systems. I mean, Michael's smart light bulbs is a good idea. Okay, what's the worst that happens to you, unless they use it as a staging point for other elements of your home network? Okay, well, it gets the light goes off. Maybe that's not ideal, but it's not a disaster. But if that light bulb has been recruited into a botnet and 100,000 of these light bulbs then suddenly launch a massive denial of service attack, this kind of thing has happened. I'm not just theorizing here. Then that can be really damaging to whether it's to private sector companies that are perhaps being blackmailed. I'm sure you've all heard of the ransomware attacks that are increasingly popular, where organizations that they find that all of their data has been encrypted and they have to pay X Bitcoins to get the key to decrypt it from some cyber criminal gang. But that kind of stuff is even hitting critical infrastructure like hospitals these days. I'm sure you've seen those cases in the news. And we need to find ways to force people to internalize those costs. So actually, Michael's example of the California law, the UK government has been considering something similar, but for reasons I'm not quite sure of, they won't even go that far. They won't even make it a legal requirement. Really, really basic security precautions, like not using the same password on all of your smart devices that can be easily guessed by anyone. The UK government doesn't seem to want to even go that far.
Yeah, I think one theme, I mean, I'm not going to go to the contracting because that's Catalina's area of expertise in particular, especially here. One thing I think pervades it, when we think of how would you outsource security expertise? So you could do a few things. We look at what universities do. Universities are often wholesale just getting services in from external contractors, because what we've learned over as Ross Addison's new book particularly does a great job of looking at this, is that you can have lots of good parts, but they don't make a good whole. And that's the problem with security. We'd love them to. And actually in the law, many legal instruments implicitly assume that lots of good parts make a good whole. Data protection does this too. You kind of see this a little bit behind the scenes and you think, well, actually there's some fundamental unsaid assumptions there. You could have a load of really secure things, weave them together, and suddenly you've got a massive insecurity for a new emergent reason. So universities might say, okay, we need to host our lecture content or host our seminars online in a way that's access controlled. We're going to pay an external company and they will do the hosting. We will basically just move our DNS server to point to their server. And we may have a federated login with them, which is the real main link. Like we have an authentication point like Shibboleth or these kind of things, or Office 365. And that's the only place these two systems really touch each other in a significant way, apart from there being access from the network that you're on the whole time. So there are other ways, but in terms of integration. And then they say, let's put the responsibility on this third party who has this vertically integrated approach. So sometimes you can do that. That has implications for competition and power and many other areas. But sometimes you can't. If you're talking about how do you manage devices that you give to your employees, for example, it's really hard to say, if you're an EMB, an electoral management body there, it's hard just to get an expert who sits somewhere else to give you advice on how to do this, because it's all about your organizational routines, social practices. You really need someone embedded in the fabric of that organization to be able to know and make convincing change that can improve security. And I can't remember if Ian said it, but an interesting challenge with EMBs in particular, and universities have this challenge too in some countries, though less so than electoral bodies, is maintaining independence. There's really a side of EMBs who they can't rely on the government's security apparatus, often because the government security apparatus is linked to the government intelligence apparatus, like in the UK, but in many other countries too, which is a sort of, because that's where the capacity was, and it was a very urgent need to develop a capacity, and it had to kind of come out of somewhere existing. So of course the electoral body in a country which has trouble transitioning can't rely on the intelligence agency to secure them. Similarly, in some countries, universities will maybe be unwilling to provide full access to their systems to a government entity. So who is the threat? What is the threat model, and what's the adversary here is important to consider for all public institutions. And sometimes those can be internal too.
Thanks a lot. So Bart van der Heuvel made an interesting, an obvious comment about responsibility, that you really can't outsource that. Maybe Bart, who's the CISO at Maastricht University, you want to elaborate on that?
Well, it's just merely a comment because you mentioned leave the responsibility to this outsourced firm. So I want to comment. Well, the real responsibility lies with you as an institution, and I think this is a mistake often made, to think you can outsource responsibility. That's merely the comment I make.
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose what I meant by that in a more nuanced way is that there are emerging governance mechanisms where many organizations may club together and help fund a certification or audits or so on of this body, which otherwise would be too costly for them to do independently. So you might have lots of universities who, maybe not formally or explicitly, are funding an audit of this external body. Now that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, as you say, they just leave it and just outsource responsibility and don't care anymore and assume it's fine. But there are methods like that. And so I think we have to be because cybersecurity affects organizations from big to tiny, we have to think of ways to scale what is a really complex needs to be expert driven and difficult task of auditing. And we see that as well with open source software. Obviously we saw with Heartbleed and OpenSSL, but Linux packages themselves are often really problematic in general, and we don't have a great resource. These are many volunteers that are maintaining these. So what do we seek to do instead? Maybe we should think of more publicly minded or collaborative methods to get the public good of these nice, open, powerful packages, which do much better than proprietary tools a lot of the time. But unfortunately, many companies can't rely on to deploy because they haven't got the security resource. But if they were secured, there'd be a great public good. But it's hard to do that. So I think this needs a bigger interactive effort, so international effort as well.
Maybe following up on the responsibility element. So what I expect to see is that because more and more institutions are being hit with cyber attacks, and not only public institutions, but also private companies who suffer a lot and don't have the resources to have sufficient protection. So I think what is inevitable is that for reasons of economies of scale, is that the security is going to be elevated to, for example, the national level, where the government will step in at some point to provide these services to an extent. What I find tricky also, based on the presentation that you had, where you mentioned the social engineering aspect, that it's often the humans that are targeted by these attackers. Of course, when you elevate these services to the national level, then the technical framework can improve. But what about the human framework? So how to deal on a national level with the social engineering aspects? That's something I really don't know how to deal with. So do you have any thoughts on that, Ian or Michael?
I've got a very particular small part of the answer to your question, but I agree it's a big, difficult question. The UK government has followed exactly the path that you're describing. They've gone from a sort of quite hands-off, it's your responsibility by and large, private sector, to secure your systems, and perhaps we'll give you, very big strategic firms might get quiet threat updates from, the UK intelligence agencies, especially relating to state actors, overseas state actors that might be attacking UK critical infrastructure. But by and large, hands off. They realized that that was not working. They set up what it's called the National Cybersecurity Centre. It's part of GCHQ, which is the big signals intelligence agency of the UK government, mainly just because that's where a lot of the expertise of the government happen to reside. I think that's not ideal, I think, as an organizational relationship, because they have very different incentives. The parent body, which has 90% of the budget, as Michael said, likes to have known vulnerabilities and ways that it can use to break into other systems. But anyway, the NCSC started, it was mainly giving guidance to the private sector. And then the government decided that still was not enough, actually. So maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I think, the NCSC moved to a significantly more sort of activist stance in terms of not just assisting companies, but also developing technical tools in the UK internet infrastructure to try to, for example, coming back to your question, block access to known phishing and fraud sites to the whole, to all UK internet users. That raises interesting questions as well. How far do we want as democracies to entrust the ability to do that to intelligence agencies, which by their nature are very opaque? It's difficult.
One extra thing to maybe add to that in the example of universities, a real, again, this is the crossover between data protection and privacy and cybersecurity. But when we see the way that universities have dealt with obligations under data protection, there is a real tension here in terms of the social factors, because universities have researchers who move between universities, who have research projects, often with a lot of sensitive data they're managing themselves. And they come with different skills, necessarily to achieve their aims. They've got different software skills, different organizational collaboration needs, and so on. And so universities have been stuck in this quite strange conceptual place where the university, you don't want to make individual researchers personally financially liable for breaches, but you also want the university should probably be the one that's liable. But at the same time, the university can't have active oversight and can't be coercively controlling and demanding researchers only use certain tools, only collaborate in certain ways to some extreme extent, because you really get not only a problem of overreach and stifling of academic freedom, but just frankly, you won't produce the best research anymore because you haven't got the flexibility that you need. So that is a sort of social element. And I think you have this kind of central, organizations that are decentralized in some ways by nature, but have the cybersecurity and data protection have these centralizing institutional forces, and balancing those is key. But also, if we move, it's only going to get worse in the private sector. If we are moving more towards kind of gig economy or portfolio work, or people taking different jobs at different organizations, they're going to have heavily interlinked devices. It's very hard for them to firewall these things, and they don't have the capacity or the tools right now to really separate those things out themselves. So, it's going to continue to be a problem. And as you say, Gase, when you think about the role of big organizations in the overarching one, in telling an overarching one to control a decentralized one, that becomes a big tension indeed.
It'll also be interesting to see from a legal perspective how these duties of care will develop, because with execution of certain tasks will also come responsibility, including legal responsibility as well. We have Bogdan who wants to respond, and if others have questions, please do raise your hand or indicate in the chat.
Yeah, so just following up on that, because that's the duty of care, it's actually a very interesting point. But like, to follow up on what Gijs and Jan said, what if we would just shift? I mean, of course, we need the technical training for actual technical department and so on. But what if like the public institution would also invest a lot? And I know private companies does it a lot. Some public might do it. I of course I don't know them all, but I know it's a hot topic now in private sector. But what if we shift the focus on training all the people? Because at the end of the day, as you mentioned as well, that's the weakest link when we talk about social engineering and so on, phishing attacks and so on. So what if we would have actually a lot of strong programs in place to train everybody that virtually uses a computer nowadays, especially we're all home and things like that, and actually invest a lot in that and just educate people and kind of try to invest in digital literacy to teach people how to avoid this and to safely use their computers and digital devices.
I think education, absolutely. I think also, though, it's a really important point of people like Angela Sasa, who Michael mentioned in the human factors element. Why are we as a society allowing technical companies to produce systems that are so hard to use in a secure way? We can try to teach users to use them in a secure way, but why aren't they secure by design and by default, as the GDPR says about data protection? And I used to actually work with Angela at UCL, where Michael is now, and Angela used to get very annoyed at tech companies that would blame the user and say, it's the weakest link, it's all their fault. And Angela said, well, why tech companies are you providing systems that aren't just hard to use in a secure way, but actively they actively obstruct people from doing what they want to do with the systems in a secure way. The security mechanisms that get in the way and stop you doing the things that you need to do for your job. It's not going to make anyone happy.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting tension there with the development of internet services too, because as new and attractive, what we see, I think, in practice, as new and attractive services emerge, whether it's like Trello or Slack or something like that, or new messengers that work really nicely on mobile devices and so on, or watches and whatever you want. And people want to use those, and they also want to use those in this kind of hyper-productive work, kind of Calvinist context we've emerged. And of course, they're going to do that because organizations haven't provided their own or alternatives. We see those in health settings. I'm sure I see that you're inside in front of Maastricht Hospital, right, in the image there in your virtual background. And in hospitals, I'm sure in that hospital, people are WhatsApping each other, with information about patients. And that's actually, from a pure security point of view, it's not actually such a bad thing compared to other alternatives that are possible. But the hospital is not provided an infrastructure alternative. So we have a real problem of rapidity here. We always talk about, can the law keep up with technology? We really have an example of, can can institutions keep up with the general generic offering of tech companies so that it becomes not much more difficult to use a secured and integrated platform that is kind of more, well, sovereign is a horrible word, but more under the under the auspices of a broader security strategy. Otherwise, people will go around and use alternatives, and that's going to be very difficult to manage. So that incentives is one for the market as a whole, and a market failure in many ways, rather than alternatively. And it wouldn't be, let's not forget, it wouldn't be if the hospital could buy WhatsApp and install it on its own servers. This is the whole point is these are agile cloud services elsewhere. If WhatsApp was a for sale product and it was good, you could say, I'm either going to ban it or we're going to buy it and you use it internally. That's not an option with a lot of these. They force people into routines that are outside their organization because they want their business.
Imagine what will happen if we have decentralized apps where there's actually no responsibility for the new WhatsApp provider, the decentralized one. Yeah. Catalina, do you want to add a little bit on the liability and the limitation of liability, perhaps?
Yeah, so I actually want to ask you both, first of all, really fantastic presentation, just like the paper. I would like to maybe speak a little bit about regulation and ask you about that, because I think just to build on what you were mentioning, Michael, this idea of keeping up, right? So to a certain extent, law is there in society in a rather adversarial environment. So there's always a workaround, when it comes to legal provisions, when it comes to legal safeguards. And then maybe if a legal system is kind of agile enough, it is able to cover that, and it is able to deliver some sort of public goods and public justice with a minimal type of maybe, I don't know, unmapped adversariality. But in this industry, to my very humble understanding, after reading Bruce Schneier's book, Click Here to Kill Everybody, which kind of left me with this kind of attitude of, well, why are we even trying? Because we're all going to be, killed by all of these not Petya type of situations, kind of sitting in between private and public threats. And I was wondering if you agree with this idea that maybe this field, let's call it generally cybersecurity, is just incredibly adversarial at a pace that might be unprecedented on the one hand. And if that is the case, if you agree with this, then how do we regulate this level, this speedy type of adversariality? What's the way ahead?
Michael, do you want to talk law, and then I could talk more computing?
Yeah, I think it's tough. Like you hit this problem of discretionary regulator versus like hard written law, and discretionary regulators also come with challenges, both in terms of security, but also human rights and many other areas. It would be nice. I think I'm just going to leave it and say it would be nice if we had, say, politicians, if technical issues became political issues, if we had parliamentary committees that were well staffed, which actually their job was looking and thinking about these issues, and they saw them as a problem, and they saw them as something that needed legitimate updating and reacting to in real time, and that those issues could be brought to their attention, that could be steered in a more legitimate way. We don't, so we end up in this unhappy place. So maybe we have to go back and reimagining what would it like to make this all more political, because I don't think we get anywhere by we're gonna, if we end up saying it's a technical thing, we're going to end up where the European Commission got to, which is by standardizing things no one cared about, and now the things it standardizes are all hyper political, and it's very hard to justify the European Commission from a democratic point of view, given the real value judgments and distributional choices it makes in proposing regulations, which are very different than when it was focusing on, can you export a seedling to one place or another on plant disease and just general public goods. So I think that's where we are. If we go down that route of saying, let's get an elite elected bureaucracy, not like elite unelected bureaucracy that deals with all our technical challenges, in a few years' time, we're going to go, oh, those are all really political, and that was a really bad idea.
I, Catalina, like you, almost despair, because this is such a gigantic, excuse the language, but I think it's an appropriate word, clusterfuck. You hardly know where to begin. I think part of that is the technical part. I agree with everything Michael just said. I think that computer science as a field knows how to design much, much more secure systems. And I think we need to find ways to incentivize organizations to buy them. I mean, that's why software companies don't produce them, because nobody wants to buy them. It used to be the case in the 80s. Defense bureaucracies, famously the US Department of Defense, would insist on much higher standards, security standards in some of the systems that it procured. But they got frustrated at the increased cost, especially since they were the major customer. You know, this wasn't something that 10,000 other organizations were building, and the slow pace of development that resulted. And that goes back to the tension that Michael was talking about, the sort of agility between what we've all got used to today, which is incredibly rapidly developed and deployed systems, which fuel wonderful innovation and are available at very low cost. I think the insecurity is almost an essential flip side of that. I don't know that you can keep that agility in anything like what we have today while producing, you know, much more significantly secure systems. I see lots of interesting, you know, tech being developed. Actually, one place I am more optimistic is my Apple fanboy technologies. The iPhone, and actually Google as well, Android, are doing really interesting things in terms of security in the operating system, also making use of elements in the underlying chips and chipsets, having, you know, specific security coprocessors, trusted enclaves where data can be really stored very secure, physically securely on your phone. So I think in one sense, the smartphone platform is developing better than the personal computer platform has developed over time. But of course, as Michael said, that also leads to power and competition issues. You know, does that put just everything in the hands of Google and Apple?
Okay, thanks a lot. Bart, I see you unmuted yourself. Is that because you wanted to respond, or was that?
No, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so we're running over time, as we do mostly with these types of events. I think that also signals the success of it. But we also do need to wrap it up, unfortunately. So again, many thanks to the speakers, Ian and Michael. This was really fantastic. Also, thanks to all the attendees and the participants in the discussion. I think this was a very good discussion, which raised already some questions. And at least I had like one or two possible research questions for future research. So let's do this again. So this event was part of the Cyber Awareness Month here at Maastricht University. We had our first event with students, and some of them are actually here who are also working on cybersecurity and have produced papers and actually took a course on cybersecurity. So this is the second event, and more to follow. So yeah, let's work on this collaboratively so that we can create a little bit of more space. So speakers, thank you, but also many thanks again to Catalina who put this together and did this greatly as always. So thanks to Catalina as well. And with that, I would like to wish everybody a good day.